All right, welcome back to another episode of the On Coaching Podcast with Magness and Marcus. I'm Steve Magness, the Deputy Director of High Performance West, coach at University of Houston, and joined by my good buddy and colleague, John Marcus. John, how are you?
I'm great. We're back. We're here to give the people what they want. And I've actually been wanting to get Lauren Fleshman on the podcast for a long time. I mean, coach, athlete, mentor, business owner, advocate, impresario, writer, and just all out awesome. She's the definition of a polymath, and I akin what Steve and I try to do to live up to her standard of excellence that she set. So now she can kind of tell us how she got where she is and lead the way and shepherd Steve and I to that next level. Lauren, welcome to the podcast.
Well, no pressure or anything. I mean, geez, I'm shepherding. Okay. Well, let's see. First of all, thank you for having me on. It is a privilege. And as I know we'll get into at some point, it's also a little bit intimidating because I feel a little bit like I'm representing a larger group of women in a way, which is an interesting dynamic. I'm just me. I can only speak for myself and my own experiences, but I that at some point in this conversation, I'll want to get into talking a little bit about women in coaching as well. But just a disclaimer, I'm not an expert in women on coaching, and I'm not an expert on women coaches, but I can really only be an expert on me and my experiences.
Well, yeah. Let's talk about your experience then.
Yeah, so I have come to coaching from a professional athlete side of things, which as an athlete, I was a little bit turned off by professional athletes that became coaches and heard very mixed reviews on how that could go down. A lot of times you'd hear stories like, oh, this coach just trained their athletes the way they operated when they were an athlete. That seemed to be the most common limitation was an athlete become coach can really only train athletes like themselves. And I saw that as a potential problem for sure, because you really only have a case study of one when you have approached the sport as an athlete first. And I've have 12 years of professional running experience, and then essentially college and high school were to some degree fairly professional because I was doing it at such a high level for so long, especially college at Stanford. But one of the things I had going for me that made stepping into coaching less intimidating was having worked with a variety of coaches and a variety of training philosophies. Some that were really heavy on the science, some that were a little bit more woo-woo, some that had different mixtures of the two. And over time, I found that I started to forge my own ideas and started to feel a little bit comfortable, dipping my toe into it, and then very gradually stepping more strongly into coaching. And then I think it only took about 3 years before I was willing to call myself a coach, even though I had been doing it that whole time. My first coaching experience was actually sort of handed to me by Stephanie Bruce. She was coached by Brad Hudson at the time, living in Eugene. And I was coached by Mark Rowland at the time, living in Eugene, just transitioning from being coached by Vin Lanana. And she coached this group of Thursday night runners, record runners in the community. And they became called the Flyers. And every Thursday they'd come for a work, get their butt kicked, basically. And they varied in distances from 10K to marathon. And there were about 25 to 35, depending on the day, that would show up. And this team had been passed from pro athlete to pro athlete kind of every year. And I don't even know the full lineage of the group, but it's kind of interesting. And then it passed from Stephanie to me when she moved to Flagstaff. And so I was terrified to coach this group of people because I didn't have any coaching experience. But they gave me my first taste of what it was like, the rewards of seeing people kind of like catch your fire and feel motivated to, get them excited about the goals that they have, to instill belief, to start sort of tinkering and figuring out what each athlete's strengths and weaknesses are and what language running they speak, what their vocabulary is, how to get to their core. And that was captivating to me. And that was my favorite part. And I really do take an individual based approach to coaching ever since that experience. And so on the positive side, I feel like I have really rewarding individual interactions. On the negative side, I don't know that I could ever coach a big group again, because it would just be so much time spent on every athlete. I'd have to totally change my way of coaching. So as I look at my present and future, I really don't see myself at this time coaching big groups, but I really love coaching, a small handful of people.
So you've been coached by some of the, most, I guess, for lack of a better word, famous distance coaches in, North America in the last, decade or two. What, if you can, attribute one takeaway from each coach within your lineage or, mentorships of coaches as a professional, and then adopting it into your own coaching practice, what would that be for each era of coach that you enjoyed running for?
Well, my high school coach actually isn't a professional coach, but he could have been, or could be, I guess. The longer I've been in this sport, the more I realize how lucky I was, how dead on he was with some of the most important parts of training. And he did just a brilliant job of building our base, setting us up for long careers, and getting us to fall in love with the sport. And so from him, I really took that mixture of enjoyment and hard work. And every stage of the way, I think I've stood out in the training groups that I've trained with, because I like carried a little bit of coached along with me and really tried to keep things a little bit goofy and fun. And then in college, I worked with Vin Lanana, and our assistant coach was Dina Evans, who is one of the women professional coaches out there with the Strava Track Club. And she was our assistant coach at the time. It was her first year coaching. So I got to spend her first 4 years with her. And Vin was a master at coaching big groups and getting, the top athletes from various events to feed off of one another and create kind of like, I don't know how to explain it, like, I guess more of like the environment of a champion. And so I watched, our women's team wasn't as strong as our men's team at the time. We were good. We were finished top 5 at the worst while I was there in cross country, but our men's team won Pac-10s in track. They won NCAAs multiple times. At that point, lowest point total ever. They were known as the Machine, which I've seen there's been a resurgence of the Machine at Stanford. But we would have the top 10K NCAA champion, 1,500 meter NCAA champion, working together as often as they could, overlapping as often as they could, even though you may think they would do very few things together. He went out of their way to make sure there were opportunities for them to be together, because his philosophy was, if you put the best with the best, it will like multiply exponentially what they're capable of. They'll feed off each other, and they'll generate kind of this environment that spills over into other people. And that really rubbed off on me. And I had the privilege of working with him for years after college. I worked with him first 2 years as a pro, and then I left for a year and then came back and worked with him for 2 more years. And it was during those times that I really started to decode his training philosophy rather than just following blindly,
Right.
because I had to do so much myself, and I needed to understand why I was doing what I was doing.
Can I put a quick pin in that? I'm going to interrupt you to go on
of course.
a fast tangent. Can you talk about that year, 2003, the Machine year for the men, and also the women too, coming out and winning the team title? I mean, Stanford sweeps NCAA cross 2003. What was that like?
Well, in 2003 cross, I was a grad assistant coach that year.
Okay.
So 2002 cross was my last cross country season, and we were announced as winners, but then it turned out maybe 50 minutes later they said we were second, which was totally brutal, by the way.
Oh God.
Yes.
That was my senior year captain, and we had never won, even though we'd been number one almost every year. We had never won. So, but yeah, the men's team, being there for both teams killing it was extremely rewarding. But most of my mind was on the women's team, just finally getting it done on the day. And that was the first year that Dina Evans was head coach of that program, and versus assistant coach. So it was also rewarding. I felt like we kind of grew up together. those 4 years, and she took the reins as head coach and just knocked it out of the park.
Right.
So that was really
And
cool.
so you were helping Dina, assisting Dina at the time as a graduate, right? So what was that like? Your first year, really, okay, you graduate, your first year getting into coaching and being, with Dina, someone you and her grown up together and learned a lot with, and now seeing who were your teammates, but months before your graduation, now stepping into this role and finally getting the quote unquote monkey back and winning the NCAA title team.
Oh, it was great. I mean, it was weird though. It was a little bit, I wasn't super involved as a coach in the nitty-gritty, right? The press, I went on the runs with the team, but I completely deferred to Dina. I wasn't interjecting in any way. And I was getting a lot out of it personally, right? Because I was getting ready for my first shot in the Olympic trials in 2004. So it was advantageous for me to hang around, which you see a lot of athletes do this in Olympic years. They'll stick around one more year to maintain some consistency heading into an Olympic year. So I was, one of those people. And so there was a little bit of jealousy as it was coming together. I'm like, damn it, why didn't we get this done while I was there? But then it was also rewarding because I did feel like there were just seeds that had been planted during the years I was there by me and the women who came before me that we never really got that win ourselves. But some things just take a little bit more time to germinate and grow. And so it was, I was grateful that it just happened that 1 year when I was able to see it versus taking another 3 to 4 years and not being there at all and just reading about it on the internet or whatever.
Awesome. Yeah. I mean, it's, to me, that's one of the more definitive years of NCAA cross country from a dominance of a team standpoint. Everyone points to the men's program, obviously, scoring 24 points, to also have the complement of the women coming through and getting the job done. I mean, that's what makes that year, from a machine standpoint, even more, amazing in my mind. So thanks, Lauren. I appreciate that.
There was just something about that too that I just thought of, which was that was the first time that the women had their head coach that was devoted to them, at least since I had been there. It's possible that Beth Sullivan had that role the year before I got there, that she was head coach. I'm not sure. You'd have to check on that. But I know that during my time, that was the big difference maker between when I was on the team and the very next year was they had their own full-time head coach. And there was a lot of whining about that, justifiably so during my time, and of feeling like when I got short end of the stick a little bit, that the men's team worked with Coach Lanana every day in and day out, and we kind of got guest appearances from Coach Lanana. He was still very much in charge of our program, but we didn't see him every single time. We didn't feel the same connection and dedication from him. And this is nothing against him because it's very, 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 very common. In fact, like extremely common that you have a female assistant coach that does the majority of the emotional labor, administrative labor for the women's team, but doesn't completely get all the power and control to be viewed as like a legitimate leader. So sometimes they're doing this extremely valuable work, but there's something different about the respect that is created, from athletes to coach. That woman or person is your coach, is actually the coach. They're not just there doing all the work of a coach, but they have the title of the coach. There's no person above them pulling strings. There's nowhere for your imagination to go, like who's really in charge. This is the person in charge. And so I think that just creates a lot better chance of success. And so often women's programs have the assistant coach, and the men's programs have the head coach. And I think it's changing, which is good.
Yeah, well, I think that brings up a brilliant point, which is that labels and titles and uncertainty matter in these things. When we're talking about creating that like environment of champions, just being able to go to practice and know that the person who's there taking care of you is actually in charge, like has the title, has the label, and there's no doubts about it, probably does wonders for just that team chemistry and camaraderie of bringing everybody together on that same page, wouldn't you think?
Oh, yeah. And I think I've read some stuff you've written about belief and the psychology of coaching and articles you shared. And I've often thought about that, a lot of times what you're actually doing day to day matters less than how you feel about what you're doing day to day. And having a dedicated coach for each men and women's team, or at least making sure if there's one coach for both, that both teams are getting the same treatment, really makes a difference.
Now, has that influenced your current coaching practice? Because you mentioned a little bit earlier how you can return to a large group setting like the Flyers, and you said you find a little bit more value or a little bit more engagement from yourself from that smaller, intimate coach to athlete, bespoke one-to-one relationship.
Yeah, I think it's easiest to kind of stand with authority and for me to feel legit if I know that I have the time and resources to truly devote to the people I'm working with. I'm not good at faking it, and I think I could coach a group, a recreational group whose commitment matched, what I could give that big group, but I don't think I could coach, or I wouldn't desire to coach a big group of elite athletes, because if they're putting their life on hold for this, I don't feel like I could match their commitment, with my coaching style, which is getting very deep with each athlete. I don't think I can match that with a big group, and they'd see through it in a heartbeat.
So one of the themes that I'm kind of picking up here, and that ties back to an earlier comment where you said that most elites kind of coach like they were coached, right? They train how they were trained, and that is often the downfall of making that jump from elite athlete to elite coach. But in hearing you describe, your high school coach, Vin, and I'm sure we'll get into others, but you're not only pointing out kind of what you took away, but you've kind of pointed out a couple of things where you're like, okay, I noticed this, and it's not their fault, but maybe we can do this in a better way, right? And I think that this point for young coaches is incredibly important, because a lot of times we see mentors and we see, oh, I have to do it exactly how my mentor did it, and if I don't, I'm disappointing them. But really, in that mentor-mentee relationship, it's you're trying to grow, take what they give you, and grow beyond that. So I'm just curious how you decide, like, how do you get to that point where you can sift through the good and maybe the things that need improvement on the coaches that you've experienced?
Oh, I know I get a little better at it year by year. I just refine, and I just try to have a little bit of grace with myself in the present time. The athletes I coach right now, if they went on to become coaches, would just as easily be able to say things I did well and things I sucked at. I'm positive of it. So I think it's just part of the game. What you were saying about that process of disappointing your mentor or veering too far from your mentor, that hasn't been a problem with me for high school and college, working with Vinland and also with Terrence Mahan, because by the time I started coaching, those were they were just far enough in the past where they were like a little hazy. Whereas the most challenging thing for me with my coaching right now is that my most recent coach was Mark Rowland from OTC Elite, and I had a lot of success with him. I won a national title. I was qualified for Worlds, and I finished seventh. That was at that best an American had ever done at that distance. And it was, it was very rewarding and meaningful. And it felt like there was magic happening there. And so I have those training programs in detail from what I did during that time. And I want to be able to learn from them. And I definitely reference them and look, when I'm writing programs for my athletes that have similar events. But it's really difficult once you open that spreadsheet to then not get anxiety about the things that you're doing differently from it. At least that's what I find. I don't know if you guys have any experiences like that, but it's the diverting, to have the courage to be like, it's not the program that was magical. It was the program as it was applied to me, the specifics of my body and physiology, and not just that, but my body and physiology in that moment, which was the culmination of several years of my specific successes and my specific failures. That unless I can recreate all those things for my athlete, which I can't, then there's no way applying this number by number is going to get me the same result. And so I try to use that to free myself from it, but it's still hard because like, look at a person with 20 years experience. And it's a waste of time to like really look at it and dig in and try to, I don't know, figure out how I would like translate it.
Yeah. Well, it's difficult. I think I hear you struggling, and I struggled with that before as well. And what set me free, Lauren, was realizing it's not a recipe, but it's a masterpiece. Mm-hmm. And that's the big difference. It's a masterpiece. You go and look at it. It's an artifact. You go to the museum. It's like the Mona Lisa, whatever. It just is amazing. And as much as people want to try to copy and refine it, it's doing anyone who is involved in that creation a disservice. And yet, there's good stuff in there because it got you to where it got you. Like it wasn't just totally random. So there has to be some type of methodology or some type of replicability as well, because you can repeat this, because human physiology, as we know, is not that radically different from human being. So I see that juxtaposition and that dichotomy that you're struggling with, because I dealt with that as well early on in my coaching career, like having had a seat next to Jerry and was watching what the Bowen athletes were doing in the early 2010s. It was just like wow, this is the way to do it. And it took me about 3-4 years, and actually kind of viewing myself more as a 800 1500 meter coach, and moving away from, because I viewed my self-efficacy was tied to cross-country, 5K, 10K coach, because those were my key mentors, were Jerry and Rob Connor at UP, who's known cross-country guru. So when I started to say, well, I'm gonna get into this mile or 800 meter discipline and make that my own, it kind of set me free and allowed me actually to coach better the longer stuff, the 10K, with Tara Welling and half marathon with her. But I needed to create that identity separation to go say it's okay to go explore, because I'm not going to muck up, their recipe or their pathway to success that obviously is still working so well.
Now once you put in enough years, at least for me, now I have my own spreadsheets of my own training history for my athletes. So then you end up with the same sort of trap of like, you want to look back and look at those things and see what was working well, but still the idea is to improve. The idea is to get better. And so you don't want to replicate. That doesn't work. And the times when I am most tempted to go back to those spreadsheets and like, look, is when I'm trying to peak an athlete. And I'm like, okay, let's go dig into these and find out, what did I do for the 14 days prior? And, it's not to say that's not helpful. It is helpful. But I definitely feel more freedom to riff on things I've done in the past than I was feeling riffing on things that my old coaches did in the past. That felt hard.
Well, it's those times of doubt, right? That's why, because I've done the same thing all the time. Like when you're peaking someone, especially, leading up to a couple marathons recently with athletes, like peaking for the marathon is the worst. So you kind of have these doubts, and you're like, oh, what did we do last time that worked? Or what did this person do? And it's like you're just searching and grasping for things that like give you a little bit of certainty that isn't there. And I think, and I think that's part of the process of coaching, is like there's nothing wrong with that. You just have to be kind of aware that, there was no magic formula. And similar to you guys, like I remember, when I was first getting into coaching, I'd look back at like Alan Webb's training logs and the stuff we'd been doing, because I was like, Alan Webb was the man. Like, how can I know what's better than like the guy who ran 346? So and similar, like what freed me up was coaching women, because once I got into coaching women at a high level, like I had no one to look back on, right? Because I couldn't look back at my own training. I couldn't look back at my training partners who I'd been working with. So it was like, okay, I've got to figure this out going forward. And it is really freeing to have that, just that clarity of like, what worked in the past is information, but I don't have to become reliant on it.
Sometimes I think about the early season races as such, like they're what I aspire to be all year long. Like at this race where Mel Lawrence just ran at a meet at University of Washington and she ran 8:57. First time under 9 minutes, PR'd by 6 seconds. And it was mostly the way she looked doing it. Shalane Flanagan got 2 seconds on her with, I think, 1,200 meters to go. She kind of popped out in front and got 2 seconds on her really quick, and then never got more than that. Mel just powered and maintained that space and ended up second. And it was, just seeing the difference between how those two athletes looked strong all the way to the finish versus what the other athletes in the field were looking like, which is more how I looked indoors, usually during my career. And I was like, wow, okay, she looked great. When I was planning her run up to this race, I was taking it day by day, tuning into my athlete. I was tuning into the athlete in front of me right now when I was planning her pre-race workout, when I was planning her last hard session, when I was looking at how many days out it should be. There are no hard and fast rules. Sometimes I do it 7 days before. Sometimes their last hard session 6. Sometimes it's 10 days. And I never second guessed it because I was just in the flow with my athlete in the moment. And she ended up feeling great, ran well, and looked confident, which was one of the biggest breakthroughs, the way she just carried herself to the line. I was like, wow, okay, this is a big difference from how both she and I feel season when I'm looking back at other races, looking how I tapered her coming in, and I'm not actually looking at my athlete.
Well,
that's a great point. Yeah, that's a huge point.
I think the athletes pick that up too, right? Like when we're a little, unsure and, driving ourselves nuts a little bit before the championship peaking and trying to figure things out. I mean, even if we're not directly portraying it to our athletes, I think that can kind of rub off on them and create that vibe that isn't there in like early season meet.
Mm-hmm.
Or you do what I do and you just stop believing in peaking. But I gave up believing in peaking a long time ago because, honestly, for me, the mental construct of peaking just created this anxiety on my part and the athlete part that all the work is now at this exact apex in time. And this is the only week you have to run, the races of your life this year. And I think sometimes we invest too much psychologically in this concept of peaking because it's just a construct. We know that through habituation, the body can, reach new levels of tolerance, reach new levels of, capacity or skill or what have you. And so if we think of it, when I started to think of it like that, I got a lot cooler. My hot system turned off, my cool system turned on. It's just like, hey, just do what you do. Do what you do. And I started to develop the posture of all we got to do in the 3 weeks before the big championship meet, not screw up. Just make decisions that won't screw you up. Don't eat food you don't normally eat. Don't go to Envy Massage for massage. Go to your normal masseuse. I had that one. Don't drink anything weird. Let's not do any work that's way too out of the ballpark that you've been doing. Oh, you don't feel good. You're having a hangnail today. All right, do 4 200s instead of 6. No big deal. Just don't screw up. And for me, that move got me away from that peaking anxiety, which is a real thing, and you see it year in and year out because everyone wants to do well. They, like you said, Lauren, rightfully so, sacrificed and mortgaged their lives in some regards to do the thing called professional running, which there's no guarantee. I always say it's like a casino, man. Everyone's out here throwing dice and hoping they get 7 and 11, but most people just get snake eyes because it's a rough bet.
I was thinking when you were talking about the your new approach to tapering, I was like, yeah, that's kind of, it's still an approach to tapering, right? Like putting the bubble wrap on is still it's still like a difference in how you're going to be responding to things versus how you would be like, buck up, get the 8 times the K done or whatever, unless someone's limping around. I don't actually know how you coach because I haven't seen you coach, but that's putting my experience into your story. But as an athlete, I actually really always loved it when I could see my coach start to be protective of me, as long as they weren't showing cracks in their confidence, but it was more of just like I was a prepared item. I was a machine that was ready for a job, and we just were trying to protect it. That made me feel a lot better than the concept of I have to get these last few workouts just right. Mm-hmm. Like I was still somehow building the machine. And so I always found tapering to be, I always felt confident, and almost it was funny to watch my coach squirm a little bit. Be like, "No, make sure you're getting, make sure you're not going to massage envy," or whatever it was that she said. Made me feel cared for, which was nice. But maybe not every athlete is like that.
Oh, well, yeah, again, I think it's how we cope with those anxiety and stresses. Because you're right, it's the not tapering approach. It's
yeah.
And every year, that's all, always to me, right? As you've experienced this, and maybe you can unpack this a bit here. You go into the USA meet or a world championship meet, and everyone's, stone cold killer, but walking on eggshells, simultaneously, because there's just so much at stake. It's so much on the line, because there's been all this work in preparation and diligence on the part of athlete and coach for this moment, and you want to maximize the moment. How has your experience in that as an athlete, and winning national titles, and competing to high repute at the international stage, colored now coming into those championship meets and preparing those who you guide for that moment and making the most of that moment?
I try to diffuse the moment more than anything else, because I feel like you have way more chance of screwing that up than anything else. Basically, as an athlete, if I just focused on executing, just doing what I was capable of doing, and that was it, and then having this sly smile on my face, knowing that only 5 people in that race or so would actually be able to do that on the day, because there'd be at least 3 of them psyching themselves out. There'd be 3 of them overreaching, trying to do something miraculous they've never done before, like quote peaking and doing, having the best performance of their life on that day, which is a ton of pressure. There'd be somebody running injured, at least one person, who would look strong, in the call area, but they were actually broken. Someone would be mentally tortured. And so it really comes down to just 5 people. And so I always told myself, I'm racing 5 people. And I really just need to execute what I'm capable of on the day, which is what every single workout, every key session was show up, get your job from your coach, get it done as close to your capacity as possible, and then leave. and a race is no different. And even the preparation, I mean, I think about race days, preparation for the race day, logically, my athletes the same way I do their key sessions now. It takes the pressure off of me. Race, like, typically they do a hard session on a Saturday, a long run on a Sunday, and they're ready to go again by Tuesday. So I don't have to think about like 2 weeks of, buffing them out. And so I don't know, I guess I just focus on trying to convey that to my athlete. They can just go to the line with as little pressure as possible, with something that they feel confident they can achieve. And I don't blow any smoke up their ass. I'm a huge advocate for getting rid of this believe in yourself shit, because I find it to be one of the most destructive things when you're going into a race, to be like, you just got to believe in yourself. You just got to believe in yourself, especially if you're talking about in the context of doing something they've never done before. Because it really puts too much pressure on them, that somehow it is their success or failure hinges on this amorphous idea of believing in yourself, and to me, that's a coach cop out. It's like, okay, you're basically, you just handed that over to the athlete and said, like, well, I did everything I could do. If you blow it, it's because you didn't believe in yourself. So I don't know. I mean, I feel like I don't have some kind of resume where you can say, oh, well, her athletes have made 5 Olympic teams and whatever. I have the athletes that I've coached, had reasonable success with them doing well when it counts, racing to potential when it counts. And that's all I can really ask for. And I think that sometimes as fans, when we're watching something we think looks like a huge breakthrough and a miracle, it wasn't. It was just the realization of what the person was prepared to do. So knowing that, I don't try to create miracles in my athletes.
Then, something I always encounter, whether I feel like we're well prepared or not as athlete and coach, is race day anxiety. And, I'm curious, have you encountered like race day anxiety to the point of like crippling race day anxiety, in athletes you've worked with? And if so, what are some specific, cues or conversations you've had to help diffuse that anxiety, either in the moment or once you recognize that's a limiting factor, getting them ready so it's not repeated again and again and again to the point where it's not allowing them to manifest their potential on race day?
Yeah, I think that there's one thing I've learned is that it's going to happen to every athlete, and it might happen at least once a season, where they're going to get too much in their head and they won't perform to their capacity on the day. The biggest approach that I take that I think works, because it doesn't seem to repeat itself more than one time, is I just treat it like anything else, like a poor tactical move, or like they ate some new food the night before and got the runs and race day. I was like, okay, you did something that didn't get you the result you wanted, and not make it some sort of big deal. Right. Or just because it's in the mind doesn't mean we have to make it this mystical thing.
Am I understanding you right to, sorry to interrupt, am I understanding you right to say you view it as just more transactional? It's just a transaction, like, hey, drop this, move on, no big deal. Is that correct?
Yeah, kind of. I just okay. Like, don't add an extra weight to it if it was a mental thing. And I think that as an athlete, I had negative experiences from a coach kind of making it a bigger deal when it was a mental thing versus a physical thing. If it had been a physical thing that had held me back, it would have been approached as okay, well, you stayed on the rail too long and you got boxed in, so next time do this. It would have been an easy conversation. It would be over. Yeah, but when it was a mental thing, it was suddenly like, oh, it's so woo-woo and the things are in your head and it's like, oh my God. And then it becomes this really big deal. And then the more times in a row an athlete does that, because I spent a whole year, all of 2006, I tears for races. I hated racing. Something that I'd previously loved was just torture for me all of a sudden. And I couldn't figure out how to get racing back for myself. And it was pretty frustrating. And so eventually I started working with sports psychologists. So a lot of the things that I use on my athletes are things that I learned from sports psychologists. Was I treat mental shortcomings like an Achilles injury or some other, pulled muscle or whatever, a tactical error. And we address it, we come up with a few things to try next time, and we move on. But once you've gotten really far down the path with an athlete, it does take some extra investment to help pull them out. And so what I recommend, if anyone listening to this has an athlete that's had a history of really struggling with pre-race anxiety, is to dramatically reduce the expectations. So treat it like they have just come off of a stress fracture and you're just starting them back, and create baby steps to start building confidence again. And once an athlete believes in that they will race with integrity, that they are capable of doing the thing they say they're going to do, every time they do the thing they say they're going to do, it's like it builds a brick of confidence. And then they feel comfortable taking bigger and bigger leaps to what they think they can do and what they're willing to say they're going to do. But the problem athletes get into once they get a big mental block is they try to overcompensate and make up for it by like, well, next time I'm going to really do what I'm capable of,
right. I call that the post-race pity party. Yes.
Yeah. It's brutal. And so and then if you're one of the takeaways from the sports psychologist I worked with, Darren Treasure, who I don't work with anymore, but he said when expectations don't equal reality, you get like a big mess. And so as a coach, I just look at one of my main jobs is to make sure that expectations as closely match reality as possible. And if I have an athlete tell me I've run 950 and I want to run 925, I've learned my lesson now. Like if they say that, I'm like, look, I'm not be someone that like poops on your dream. But I really feel that we should try for the 940s first. Right. And let's just take this first step, and we'll go once we've checked that box. Let's go from there. So put that stretch goal out there, but I'm not focused on that stretch goal with you right now. I'm going to focus on this goal, which is another controversial thing. There's definitely people out there, and I understand the perspective. I think you should let the athlete completely drive us on those things. But I also have learned from personal experience when I tried to make the leap from just cracking 15 in the 5K to being able to race with the top Ethiopians. The world record at the time was in the 1420s. In my ideological mind, it's not that big of a deal. you know? And
I ran 15:30 and I ran 15 flats the same.
yeah. And I was working with Terrence Mahan at the time, and he was fairly good at coaching. And so this is not a reflection on what kind of a coach he is for other people or what kind of a coach he is now. But at the time, it was a bad combination because I was very idealistic and wanted to jump ahead, and he was like, "Yeah, you can do that this year," and I was like, "Yeah," because that's what I wanted to hear.
Right.
And that really set me up for the whole next year of being horrified to race and the anxiety and stuff.
So a lot of times at the elite level, like our job, I don't know if you guys feel the same way, but our job is to almost hold athletes back from getting too ambitious on that side or getting in their own way. So I'm curious, Lauren, like how do you handle that situation? Like, how do you handle an athlete who comes to you and says, like, "Hey, I've run 15:45 in the 5K, but I really think I can run 15 flat this year"?
Oh man, yeah. I mean, I've done this wrong, just so I get that out there right now. I want people to know that I've done this wrong.
As we all have.
Hey, that's what this coaching podcast is. All the mistakes Steve and I made, and now you listen so you don't have to make them quite as bad as we did.
Yeah, I did this with my athlete, Lawrence, a couple years ago, and she wanted to make a big leap. Not surprisingly, it was an Olympic year. That's when you see the most athletes going, okay, it's going to take this to make the Olympic team. If I'm going to do this, then I'm really going to do it. And if I'm not really doing it with the intention of making the team, then what's the point? I'm just some kind of poser out here. So obviously this is all my commentary, but I've seen this countless times when I was on Oregon Track Club Elite, that athlete that's not quite making teams yet so often is like, this is what's going to take to make the team, and I have to do it now. And they wrap it up in all this other stuff of like, what I'm doing doesn't matter unless I'm making teams. And I think there's this big myth that if you do all that, that's what it takes to make a team, right?
Definitely.
And maybe that works for some people. I'm sure there's success stories out there. But what I've seen more often is a total implosion, most often leading to injury. So the athlete never even gets to get to the starting line healthy. And if the athlete gets to the starting line healthy because they're gifted with incredible durability, then it leads to the race having so much state. It takes a really special kind of brain to get to the line in that environment. I can only think of one example from people I know, Ian Dobson. When he told me when he made, I think, a 2008 team, he said he told himself, well, I have to make this team or I'm going to die, basically. And he wrapped everything into it, and it worked, and he made the team. But
I think Blankenship employed the same mentality. He said, I'm this team, or I'm going to go back to wherever and go work in a coal mine.
Yeah.
So,
and that works for
but
some people.
I agree with you. It's a little too like militaristic in my mind. It's like at the end of the day, it is just running. It is just sport. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it is, and it probably depends on your capacity to really believe that. Because you can say those words, and if you haven't really gotten yourself to believe it, you're not going to elicit the hormonal response of the old lady who can lift the car because someone's trapped under it, right? That's what you're trying to do in those situations. If you're trying to psych yourself up for the race with like a do or die mentality, you're hoping to get the old lady who can lift the car scenario, and that your race, you're going to be able to do something extraordinary. But I don't know the physiology, and Steve, maybe either of you knows this physiology, but I imagine more often than not, it triggers like a hormonal response that doesn't get you to the finish line or an underperformance kind of a situation.
Yeah, no, it definitely does. It's so interesting. Like the stress response is such a complicated and fascinating phenomenon. People think like, oh, if I just get some like adrenaline going and then some testosterone comes and then like I'm going to be able to lift that car. And what they're forgetting is like the mind and the body is smarter than like you think you are, right? So
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
it knows like, hey, if I don't do this, like this kid under the car is gonna die, right? But
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
incredibly tough to like trick your mind into thinking like, hey, if I don't do this race, like my world is gonna end. Like your mind
Well,
knows like, hey, this isn't reality, right?
exactly.
Yeah.
And in the instance of the woman with the car, she was just thinking about like what the local foliage looked like
Exactly,
Mm-hmm.
before the car landed on the kid. So
exactly.
it's different. Whereas an athlete, if they're trying to do this, we're talking days, weeks,
Yeah,
months on end
Yeah.
of creating this scenario of the car on a kid, right?
Yeah, I think it's a bastardization of what's really going on physiologically, and that's shock. That woman is shocked. And we know in shock that a flood, not just a trickle, a flood of hormones instantaneously goes into your spinal cord and flushes your whole body, right? And so shock can last for, depending on the severity of it, seconds or even minutes or even hours, right? I've known athletes who broke their foot on a steeplechase barrier and like, coach, it's fine. I feel fine. It's not a problem. And I'm like, dude, your foot is the wrong way. It is broken. And then they look down at it and the shock's already going subconsciously because they didn't look at it. And then they start screaming once they see the foot at the wrong angle. But the foot was already like that, right? Because that shock, the body just naturally had it in place. So cognitively, once your executive functioning capacity happens in your frontal lobe to make that, connection, oh, I guess it is broken.
And
It's too late.
yeah. And for anyone who really wants to understand the science of this, Alex Hutchinson wrote a fantastic book called Endurer that is actually, I think it's out next week or the week after. So
It's
probably,
coming up. Yeah.
yeah,
Mhm.
and explains these exact scenarios phenomenally for everyone to understand. So really suggest picking that up.
Yeah. I didn't get to finish it. I was having a newborn, but he sent me an early copy to
Nice.
read through. And I got through about half of it so far, and it was really illuminating. Like I definitely have taken things into my coaching from that too. So that was a good suggestion.
So veering back on track after we gone, on the off ramp here,
I love
as we're
track.
known. Oh, so talk more about what you learned, working with Roland, like one of your biggest takeaways from him. You kind of have already expounded the respect and, the weight you have for the training program, but what about with Mark as the person and also to the environment he created or had created at OTC in your time there and any transfers you've had to your current practice?
Oh yeah, I mean, it's part of the lessons I learned came from watching him coach, which I was then old enough and had been through enough coaches to be able to watch him coach and to think the coaching a little bit more versus just going along and just checking boxes. And I'm a naturally curious person, so I was studying as I was being coached by him, but also just the changes that I went through as a result of the way he coached. And I had very good self-awareness by this point. I was 28, right? So that's kind of a natural time window of your life, late 20s, early 30s, when you develop a lot more of your self-awareness and perspective and whatnot. So I was doing that while he was my coach, which was a good combination. He really treated his athletes like adults. So that was one of the biggest things I took away from it. He kind of had the perspective of, if you need babying, you're just not going to get it from me. I'm sorry. Like, you might run like shit for 2 years while you figure out how to be a grown up. And I'm willing to look bad as a coach if that's happening. Because in his mind, and I'm not saying this is right or wrong, but in his mind, you needed to have ownership of your own athletic career, ownership of your own dreams. You weren't waiting for someone to tell you what you were capable of in order to reach your just eventual potential. And he wasn't willing to hold your hand and fill in the gaps for you to get short-term results. He was like, if I'm coaching you to your ultimate potential, and this is just the unfortunate thing that's going to have to happen for a year or two while you figure it out. And so some athletes left, or it didn't work. Right. So he's not the coach for everybody. But one of the things I took from that was, I don't want to be the coach for everybody. Like I view coaching as partly helping someone realize their athletic potential, also helping shepherd them as into adults and people who will be able to take as much from the years they've spent with me into the future, whether that's to be a coach or to be more effective in the place or in their relationships or parenting, like to take that self-awareness and things that they've developed in themselves that sport was the vehicle for, and take it to their life. And so, yeah, I'm a firm believer that the only way to really follow through with that is to coach people to be adults. And so some people come in to be coached and they already are pretty much adults. And then some people, they need a little bit of tough love or nudging or whatever to get there. And with the case of, I look at like Lawrence is the athlete I have right now, is healthy and she's doing well. I'm coaching her sister, Collier Lawrence, too, who's also a great example of an adult who's had navicular surgery. So she's I think 5 months out from that right now. So she's not training or racing in a significant way yet. Now, I've worked with her for I think 4 years. And when she first came in, she couldn't have told me really what her goals were. She couldn't make decisions on the fly of how, if I told her do 6 to 8 times, I asked her after 6, do you think you should be done or not, to engage athletes with those decisions. She wouldn't have been able to tell me. There's a big part of her still trying to please the coach or look for application. And so now, where she could train anywhere in the country and be able to look after herself, be able to make those on the fly decisions most of the time. And I don't think anybody can do it necessarily. Very few people can do it all the time, where you just coach yourself, right? So there's people that can, but it's very difficult. But yeah, she's, and I think it's really showing. She carries herself differently. She carries herself with this confidence. She can talk about her goals as if they're hers, because they are. And I look at my job as to that she's driving the bus and I'm the passenger and I'm helping her get there. And that is the way that I like to coach the most. And that's, I'm really starting to see the fruits of the labor in how she is enjoying herself and her ferocity, I mean, when you're on the track, it's all you. No one can help you. It is you.
That's
and in
the beauty.
End, that's what we're training you to do.
Yeah.
So it's hard though, and I am fortunate in that I'm not relying on funding. It's dependent on short-term results. I do this because I love it and I care about these people. And so I can do it in the way I want to. I can play a longer game. And I totally recognize that that's a privilege, and not every coach has that privilege. And at a college level, that's one of the reasons I wouldn't want to coach in college, because I feel like you'd have to almost stunt the development of athletes for short-term gain in the most competitive D1 programs. Like I at one point got offered a interview for a Stanford job, and I was like, I do not want that job. I do not want that job.
Well, that's wise. You have 2 feet on the ground and you know what matters. And I think you articulate that very well, Lauren. Like, you're able to play a long-term game. And I think that's the special seat you occupy. And Steve and myself, since we're not dependent on, funding from an outside, bucket of money that says you have to do this and show your worth in this quarter or in this year. Otherwise, we're not going to re-up or re-engage you. And that creates a scarcity mindset, right? From everyone involved. And here now, I was talking to an athlete today, and I told her, like, hey, look, I know you're wanting to cross train, like, you have a new athlete and she just showed up with a stress fracture. And I'm like, look, 2 days before you go see the doctor and get the, professional diagnosis is not going to make or break 2020. And she was like, what are you talking about? I go, that's what I'm thinking. I'm already thinking in 2020. It's, I'm thinking 3 years ahead. I'm not thinking about the U.S. Championships indoors or outdoors this year. I'm thinking long term with you, because that's why you're here. That's why you've, chosen to show up and do this, not for the immediate gratification, but for long term sustainability. And I think you're right. People look to college programs and criticize them. And maybe, Steve, you can articulate, since you are actually still in the college space, about the short termness that happens because you have to produce and get the athlete ready for cross, indoor and outdoor, and do that programming for 3, 4, or a 5th year, if you do redshirt them. And we don't have to, which is a very special privileged seat that few, occupy.
Yeah, just speaking from the college side of things, it's completely unsustainable, and you do have to make sacrifices. If you choose to try to run well cross country indoors and outdoors. I was talking to a good friend and fellow coach who basically told me, is like, I don't care about indoors. Like, we don't go after it. And we're kind of similar here with my guys at Houston, because like, it's just impossible. Like, physiologically, it's impossible to be sharp and ready to go all year round. But at a lot of programs, like, it is necessary, right? Because they expect you to do well at your conference meet indoors and make nationals, and then come back outdoors and do the same, and then do well in cross. So the system itself is not set up in a way that is for athlete development. So if you have that athlete who might have the talent to run on the next level, it really comes on the onus of the coach to figure out ways how to protect that athlete from the system, which is a strange thing to do, and kind of indicative on NCAA running in itself, I guess.
I remember that too as an athlete, and it created a lot of really weird team dynamics, because there were the athletes who were being protected and saved, and then there were the athletes that had to show up and run Mountain Pacific Indoor Championships, who had been Foot Locker finalists, who had been state champions in their own right, but in the new pecking order, they were the ones that, the head track and field coach needed distance runners who could get points, and they wanted the best ones, but they could get the second best ones, or the fifth best ones, and they'd go and they'd get those points. But in training and for those races and competing, it was like the barrier for those athletes ever reaching the top tier. It's like they got stuck there, and that was just one of the painful realities of the sport, because they knew it. The athletes that got to run top 7 on the men's team, especially like 40 guys or something at Stanford when they got the 24 points at nationals or whatever. They had so many guys, and they were all so good. And if you were the guy that got chosen to run the regional meet, which no one cared about at that point because they were so dominant, you knew you weren't going to run nationals. You weren't going to get the shot. This was your shot. This was, you were the pinch hitter or whatever, to save the legs of the other athletes. So yeah, I don't know. It's strange, but it's it's just the way it is in those deep programs, and that's one of the main reasons why we're not really talking completely about college right now. But I am a huge advocate for not going to those top few D1 schools that are so deep, where you're not going to get the true opportunity to develop unless you just feel so compelled to go there. If you're on the fence at all, I would tell athletes to be open-minded to more options.
I think I'm right there with you, Lauren, because I think, there's amazing coaches and they have amazing facilities and amazing resources, but the coach to athlete ratio is only so high. I mean, or actually more so low. Even though they might have, all these coaches in the world on staff, it's still a pecking order, and you only can have so many alphas in a cohort before someone has to be submissive. And so you recruit all these alphas, champions, national record holders, state champions, whatever. And then the unpacking order of submission has to come into play. And what ends up happening is it suffocates that alpha who was blossoming in high school, that now no longer has the soil and the fruit to do so. And that career has come to an end. And it's no one's fault. It's not like, I don't have the hubris to think I can coach a cohort of, 20, 30 alphas myself, even, professionally. Like, I'm hovering around 15, and that's kind of it, man. That's my threshold. I can sustain probably, a cross-country team, which I call a front 7 and a back 7. And even then, there has to be pecking order as well with, these men and women's livelihoods and careers are on the line, because, you're just one person. And Tara Welling astutely took that path. She turned down going the, Power 5 big school route for like LMU, which is in the WCC. But, her coach, Scott Guerrero at LMU, gave her all the attention. He was able to really focus on her and very prudently and meticulously build her mileage up. She didn't get hurt that much. I mean, it's the thing she always points to is what propelled her to be able to have a professional career and sustain it, and also be resilient and come back from these injuries, versus many times you see that athlete who went to a Power 5 school, and it's not that the coaching is bad at all. It's not. It's actually very, very good. It's the rigors of high-level performance, having to score at conference meets 3 times a year, having to be ready at regional meets twice a year, and having to score at championship meets 3 times a year. That's a lot of times a year to be on. And you and I know. Yeah.
Like confidence is the other thing that gets sacrificed. It's really, I feel like the ability to go to a program and feel good about what you're doing and feel like you matter probably carries you a lot further than the specifics of the training in some ways. As long as you get about 90% right, the physiological side, the other side of it is really important. Just as an important aside, I'll only add this because I think it's important to add perspective, and I know you guys wouldn't disagree with this, but all those athletes that came to Stanford that got kind of, maybe you could argue, got chewed up in that program, running obviously is not the end of the world and the only thing that matters. And seeing the things that they went on to do, the doors that opened to them in their classrooms and in the clubs and other things that they then dove into because running wasn't doing for them what they thought it would, clearly set them on a different path, but like a really great path in most of those cases, right? Yes. So I look at some athletes where I'm like, man, it was still the perfect choice for you as a career person and as a human being, even if it wasn't the perfect choice for the running dream that you had. So that can happen too.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I have a question.
Sure.
I have a question about coaching.
We're on coaching, yes.
Well, that's great. So I have a question on coaching. So I have gone through a transition this year in my approach where I am doing less of a long fall and winter build, and doing more, I don't know, I guess you'd call them like legit workouts, harder workouts earlier in the season. And it's a first for me. And in the past, I've really waited until March. And what changed, just so you know, what changed my approach has been the lack of opportunities available for racing. And what I learned the hard way was, if you're not coaching an athlete who's making teams, if they don't run well early, then they don't get into the races. They won't even get a lane in the races that allow them to reach their potential. So then they're in a position all year to be trying to reach their potential from the front, which is just so hard. And so I had a huge bias against doing this for a really long time. But then in looking back in my career, Providence College, Ray Tracy was an example of a coach who always seemed to have athletes running really well year round. They may not run that much faster out at outdoor nationals than they do at indoor nationals, but if you're running under 15 minutes indoors, you don't, like, who's to say that it's a negative thing if you're not running that much faster than sub 15 outdoors. And as an athlete, that always puzzled me when I'd compete against people like Kim Smith or Molly Huddle. I was like, how are they so damn good all year long? And then I got an advanced copy of Dina Castor's book, and I saw some themes in there, and then looking at Jerry's group and how a lot of those athletes are able to run well early and often. And they also peak, like Courtney Frericks, who has like this incredible jump at the absolute best race of the year. But they're also running well. Someone like Shalane Flanagan is running well all year. So anyway, I am doing some experimenting this year. I'm nudging things a little bit and doing less of a big base pyramid model. And I just wondered what you guys thought of that and what your experiences with that have been.
Steve, you want to jump in first, or you want me to go?
I'll jump in. Sure.
Okay.
So, my experience on the professional side is I've moved more towards of that model of being pretty dang fit for most of the year, or being fit enough to race pretty well. So if you look at our training for most of my post-collegiates, it's what I'd call like a blended or a mixed periodization more than like a pyramid. So instead of like building blocks on top of each other, like stuff is always included. So we're always running somewhat fast in practice, and sometimes like The workouts are relatively intense from the get-go. So I've in the modern world of professional running, I think it's almost a little bit of a necessity, especially if you have to hit some times, right? What I've done to kind of safeguard myself against that is I've built in like what I call like refresh periods, where I'm like, okay, like we're gonna be really ready to go maybe at the first Stanford invite, so we can get a fast 5K. But I'm gonna build in this like 2.5 week period where I'm gonna go just back to like straight aerobic stuff, just to make sure that we're good and can sustain it. That being said, what I've noticed on the younger level, maybe the college level or just out of college, is that like you have to spend time almost having a little bit more of that traditional period, because they have to have that foundation before we can kind of get to where they can handle that intensity year round, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it kind of makes me think of more of like a macro period, because it makes me think, Mel is 28, and so she has spent, if you look at it instead of by the season of a period of a big base and then this middle area and then the peak, you look at it as she's already spent 10 years building the bottom of her pyramid.
Right.
Cumulatively. And so she can do more of this blended training because she has those years under her belt. And that also makes sense why so many of these examples I've seen are in professionals, not necessarily collegiates, and in particular the older professionals that are able to do this.
Yeah, I think you got to develop a musician mindset. And I always communicate to athletes I work with, you're out gigging. You got to go gig for shows. Like someone says, hey, we got an opening here and you can play your song. You go, you play. And no one's going to come to a concert or come to, a little acoustic theater to hear you not be able to play your best. And so we develop that mindset of, I got to be able to gig. So I got to, like you said, I have to show fitness to get the lane. And then once I get the lane, I got to do something with that lane. And it's a sustainable cycle that you need to be able to replicate year in and year out. With that mindset, you don't go to a concert and oh, well, they sung really well at this one, and then the next day they had laryngitis and they couldn't sing at all. There is some, repeatability there. And that, I think, for the professional athlete, that's the game. That's the world you live in. And with that mindset, we know, again, homeostasis, when you reach that new level of stasis, if you can maintain and not get too greedy and not overreach, well, yeah, you can have a certain degree of competitiveness for a sustained period of time. I'll happily point to like Daniel Herrera, who, broke 4 minutes for the mile on the track, once every month for 3 months straight. He was in that sub 4 fitness for 3 straight months. I mean, he competed last year, almost 30 times from March to October. Didn't get hurt, not a lot of variant. He was just kind of in that 4 flat to 356 type mile shape, or you can put on the 15, like 339 to 342. And I mean, yeah, he'd, lay some eggs here and there because he's human, but people knew they were going to get this product when they signed him up for a race. Like, hey, can you come here and set the national record for Mexico? Hey, can you come here and try to take a shot?
Yeah.
Hey, can you come here? And I think you just have to understand the economics of the sport in that regard, as well as a coach and as an athlete.
I think it's just having the courage to know, too, that your athlete is ready for it and capable of it, and then veering from that very comfortable pyramid base thing that all of us have been taught and shown.
Well, I think it's really useful for youth. I think it's very valuable from a young, because you're developing a young physiological being that's still growing, right? And so if, I've famously said before, if you give me a person where their hearts and lungs are getting bigger every year, I'm going to look like the best coach in the world can do anything, because that's just, those things are growing rapidly. And, but I think that's the more prudent and traditional route to set the athlete up for sustained competitiveness or sustained enjoyment in the sport, to take that big pyramid approach. But, once you get to the big leagues, man, you got to be hitting daggers at the season opener. Kind of how Mel was. Like, I was there. I watched that race. Mel looked awesome. I was like, yes, finally, this is going to, I'm excited for her, man. It's like, she just looked in another world. Like, she was at home. The track was her space, and she knew exactly what she was going to do, and she got it done. And I mean, I'm sure that's a long time coming, from your perspective and hers, but it was great to finally see the fruition. And
You actually just reminded me of something. Sorry.
go ahead.
I was just thinking about, I saw some evidence of my growth as a coach after that race, because when I was first starting out, I used to have an athlete would have a performance, and I would talk and talk and talk and talk and talk about the performance with that. And I don't know, I would kind of couldn't even really follow my own train of thought sometimes, because I was like trying really hard to get them to take as much from the race as possible. It was like over explaining in a book. You're trying to read a book and they're over explaining things instead of letting the reader do some of the figuring out for themselves. And as the years have gone by, I've gotten more and more comfortable leaving things unsaid and simplifying what I leave the athlete with. And I've noticed that I've been doing that with her in workouts, and also after that race, I took some time to think about what I wanted to say and did less of just the verbal exploding. And I was like, how can you make every venue you go to feel like your home venue? Like, that was kind of the takeaway I left her with from that race, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because like you said, it was her home venue, and you could tell she was in a whole other level of comfort. And so just kind of leaving her with one task. This is an early season race. We don't have to over celebrate and be crazy excited and add all this extra pressure or project forward into what's now possible. Instead, let's just like treat this like a workout, treat this like one day in the year, and let's figure out what you can take from it that will help us move forward. And again, I keep plugging this book, but Dina Castor's book, if you guys are going to love it, if you haven't read it yet. It's not out yet, but I think it's called Thinking My Way to Victory. It's all about the mental breakthroughs through specific conversations, books, and experiences that led to leaps in her career that helped her get to where she went. It's very cool.
Awesome.
I think about that now. I think about like how each conversation that a coach has with their athlete can make a big difference, and I don't want to drown myself out with a bunch of extra stuff.
Yeah, you're spot on. I've had the same type of growth, because us coaches, we can talk. That's why we have a podcast, right? But I think as I have written more and gotten to practice, like say with the daily blog now that I'm, producing every day at highperformancewest.com, is it clarifies and makes my thought process more articulate and more precise and concise. And so I can just quickly get one message to, the athlete in that moment. That's all I want them to walk away with. Not vomit at them 10 things and hope to God they hear one. But just if I can beat one drum and figure that out before I speak, I've found personally too, like you have, Lauren, it leaves a bigger takeaway for them. And then they can, make their own decisions based on those statements.
And they can pick up your confidence. I feel like it shows that you're not making a big deal out of little moments if you can be more precise. I don't know. Steve, how do you feel about that in your coaching?
Oh, 100%. I think early on as coaches, like again, it's having confidence in yourself as a coach too, because like early on, you kind of just do that word vomit to hope that they pick something up, right? And
you're figuring it out.
Exactly. And it's coming from insecurity, right? Because like you don't know what to say, like you don't know exactly what went right or wrong, or how to like bring them back off this, bad race, or to like keep them going on this good race. So you just kind of vomit stuff out there and like talk and talk and talk. And what happens is like we get reinforced to do that because it feels good as a coach to say something, right? Like how many times, I remember when I was my first year in college coaching, like I'd give these great like post-race like team meeting speeches, and it felt really good to do, right? But then in asking the athletes over time, I'm like, oh man, they got nothing out of that, right? Like that was just me like making myself feel good about giving some like rah-rah speech for 20 minutes, but like they weren't in a position to like take anything away, and it was too much stuff. So I think a lot of that is like coaches just like having that need to feel like they're doing something, and we need to get rid of that and like let be precise, like one or two messages, like what's the takeaway? Okay, great, they grasp that. Okay, let's move on from it. And also have the freedom to like let the athlete explore and, kind of process things and figure things out a little bit before we try and jump in and give them some grand answer.
That is such a good point too. And I always liked it when my coaches asked me first. They said, okay, well, how'd you feel about that? And they would ask me, if it was an obvious huge breakthrough, there would be an enthusiastic high five or hug right away. But they would give me the same question, whether it was a good race, a mediocre race, or a bad race, which was, I always felt like I was being asked to take something away from it. Because I can see when I first started coaching, I would only really say that if things didn't turn out as hoped, right? That's when I would engage the athlete. But I think it's great to engage them every time. Because they're going to take away something. They're going to surprise you. My athletes surprise me with the things that they took away from it. I do the same thing with race strategy. I don't know what you guys do, but when a race is coming up, I try to press my athletes to have a plan that they're going to execute. Obviously, flexibility needs to be there too, but to have some sort of a plan. My philosophy is not you just get on the line and you just see what happens. And I know some people do that and that works fine for them.
Which I don't get, because it's not like you show up to practice and you're like, all right, guys, we're running today. Like that's the equivalent of that. It's like, no, it's very, scripted. It's very meticulous. It's planned out. It's thorough. And then you just take that attitude to a race, man. Sorry, a little pet peeve aside.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's how I tend to operate. But I've heard a few post-race interviews from some of the athletes I respect most, where it really did seem like they were like, yeah, I just got on the line and I knew I was fit and I just read the cues and went with it. I believed them. And so I'm like, okay, well, that works for some people.
I don't buy that for a second, though, personally.
In specializing in longer distance races while having a shorter distance race brain, but I was talented at longer distances, I had to break the race down. I had to have a plan to execute, because otherwise I would just lose it mentally in the race. So I carry a little bit of that bias with me into my athletes when I'm pushing them to have some sort of a strategy, additional strategy. It's one of the things that is great about the early season races is I don't interject. When my athletes have a plan that is different from what I might have said, I'm like, okay, well, this came from you. I think about it. I let it digest. And then I don't offer anything until I've thought about it. If I try not to carry a bias in of like, well, that wasn't what my idea was, so it's not going to work. I think, well, how did they get to this conclusion? They've done the workouts. I've watched the workouts and I've written the workouts, but they've done the workouts. So why did they feel that this is the best way to run that race? And usually what ends up happening is I come more around to their idea. I might make a few suggestions if I feel like it's not totally on track, but I do feel like going with their idea to some degree and incorporating it to some degree is good, because then they have the buy-in, and in the end it's their tests, it's their race, it's their career. Well,
I like that. It kind of ties back into what you talked about with Roland, is that ownership principle, and you're infusing your athletes to take ownership of how they're going to manifest their dream into a reality. So that's refreshing to hear, Lauren. I know we're going long, and we, a lot more ground to cover. Obviously, it's great to have you on. I think hopefully Steve and I can cajole you maybe coming back for part 2, because we didn't cover nearly all the things we wanted, and this is really refreshing to hear, your perspective, because I think, to me, it's critical to have an elite athlete, elite competitor who is succeed at the highest level now getting into coaching, because honestly, like, your calculus is much different than mine or Steve's, who as athletes never got the job done for various reasons.
Well, don't be too hard on yourself.
I never made a world meet. I never won a national title. Like, but it's fun being in that space now as a coach and working with people who have that potential. So it's also, I mean, I'm sure Steve can testify, but it's been super useful to me. I know I've written like a page of notes here as you've been speaking, so thank you. But I have one more question before we, let you go here. You've said it a couple times. Can you define the term woo-hoo that you've been using?
Woo-woo?
Oh, woo-woo, that's it. Woo-woo, yes, woo-woo.
Woo-woo.
Yes.
Yeah, the woo-woo stuff is just kind of stuff there might not be scientific evidence for, research papers written on. It's hard to defend. It's not to say that, and I think a lot of times woo-woo stuff gets grouped into, oh, well, it's insignificant and wrong because you can't back it up with science. I don't necessarily feel that way at all. But yes, sometimes I feel like there's just that mixture of things that are more woo-woo, and you can't really defend them in traditional ways.
Like something that's a little bit of softer understanding.
It is. It's a softer thing, and it's difficult to connect with an athlete on that stuff. If you have a coach that has they've got their science folder and then they have their woo-woo folder, and if they're doling things out from their science folder, it's easier as an athlete to like take that. You assume there's some academic rigor behind it or whatever. We carry those biases in, and then if they throw their brand of woo-woo at you, which is like their believe in yourself stuff, or maybe it's motivational quotes, maybe some of it is extremely valuable, but if it's riskier, because if it doesn't line up with your worldview, it can erode the trust in the coach, or it can do the opposite. If the positive, it can help grow their trust or deepen their relationship with the sport. But it takes a lot of emotional intelligence, social intelligence as a coach to communicate with athletes that way. An athlete that uses a lot of that actually is vehicle, and he's had a lot of success. He's actually got all of the physiology background and all that, but he is a big believer in connecting real life stuff, great lessons from teachers that aren't in sports to the training and to the work, and so it can work really, really well. So I don't know.
That's awesome. Thank you. I'm going to use that. Woo-woo. Love it.
Well, that's awesome. I think we'll wrap it up here because we've been going for a while, although there's several other topics, as John said, love to get into in some future time. But really, Lauren, just want to thank you for taking your time. I mean, I literally have 2 pages of notes of ideas, thoughts, and other things that I'm going to go back and reflect on and ponder from hearing you share this. So it's really genuine of you and to do so.
Oh, well, thank you guys. I learned a lot too, and it was a pleasure to get to kind of talk through what I've learned, and it just helps me out to do it. So I appreciate the opportunity to learn from you guys and to figure out what I believe in.
Well, great. We appreciate you sharing. It's some people, are a little tentative to do so, but I think that sharing is caring, and when you care, you share. So I appreciate it, Lauren.
Thank you.